This is from seedling to sold. Let's jump right in. Start off, this is an internal experiment that I conducted within my own greenhouse business. And the whole point behind this experiment was to see whether there's a difference in the quality of tomato plants and how quick I can get that tomato plant sold, depending on how much time it's spent underneath the grow lights in our propagation chamber. Now, here on the right hand side of the picture, this is a good example of our propagation chamber. This actually is ours. And on the right hand side of this picture, you can see some tomatoes that are about 5 days old. And on the left hand side, you see some tomatoes that are just now sprouting. This is honestly my favorite time of year. Now, the thesis behind this experiment is that allowing one extra week under the grow lights will create stronger plants, better plants, and allow for a quicker turnaround time and a quicker selling time versus plants that have been underneath the grow lights for 2 weeks. And in this picture here, you can see some plants that have been underneath the grow lights for 3 weeks. You can see they're thicker, they're not as tall, but they have a lot of foliage, which, as we all know, contributes to more root mass. The materials used in this experiment are quite basic. I used the grow lights that were in our propagation chamber, which I have previously mentioned we built ourselves. Some tomato seeds, which I will not disclose the variety that I use due to its rareness, and it's amazing to build in West Texas. There's a lot of people that want to get their hands on these seeds. And then 128 count liners, which are larger than most greenhouses use, but for a small operation like myself, they work just fine. And then as well as starting soil, or medium, however you prefer to say it. Now, the methods of this experiment are also quite simple. I just plant the tomato seeds in the 128 count liner trays, seedling trays, liner trays, and then place those trays underneath the grow lights and then monitor them for about 2 to 3 weeks, pulling a batch out at 2 weeks and then leaving some in there and then pulling that batch out at 3 weeks. And then I'll combine them and compare them in the greenhouse at a later time and then transplant them into larger pots to then be sold. And as you can see here, I have some transplants and seedlings that are part of the 2-week group. They're very long, they're lanky. And this is the transplanting process that I typically use. Today, in this picture, we are going into 3.5-inch pots and being sold to a nursery in downtown San Angelo. So the results of this experiment were not quite agreeing with my thesis. Turns out that under the 2 weeks, plants that stay under the lights for 2 weeks, they're longer, they're lanky, which contributes to a faster sell time. This is because that the plants are longer, and as they grow taller and taller, you have to move those and sell those out of the greenhouse quicker. Otherwise, you're left with a product that's real flimsy, it's weak, it's bending, it's breaking, and you don't want to sell it to the customer. Now, plants that were left underneath the grow lights for 3 weeks, as you can see in this picture on the right-hand side, they're shorter, they're darker, but they did take longer to sell because of the small and shortness of that plant. They took long enough to get to a height and a size that I felt comfortable selling those to customers, although they did produce sturdier plants. Here's another picture that shows the difference between 2 weeks and 3 weeks underneath the grow light. On the left-hand side here, you can see that the plants that were left underneath the grow lights for 2 weeks, like I said earlier, they're long, they're lanky, they're bending over every time you water them. And then on the right-hand side, you have these plants that are completely finished, ready to go in the pot, ready to go in the ground, and they're thicker. They're actually the same height as the plants that had just been transplanted into the 4-inch pots on the left-hand side. So you can see that it produces a better quality plant, but not the overall goal that I was wanting for this experiment, because the main thing in a greenhouse business is how quick can we get a good quality plant in and out of the greenhouse into a customer's hands. Now, if you're a large greenhouse producer, yes, you're going to want to get those plants out quick and you want to get them sold. Now, for someone like me, you're going to have a lot of time, a lot of wiggle room with the smaller customer base and area that you're working with. So the 3 weeks works fine for me. You can set those tomato plants and leave them in there for 3 weeks, and they'll do just fine. You'll actually have a higher quality plant when you sell them to the customer versus a plants that stayed underneath the grow lights for 2 weeks. Now, the end game for all these plants end up the same. They still produce amazing tomatoes, as you can see here in this picture. These are actual tomatoes on a harvest from one day on my operation. And you can see that it doesn't matter if they were underneath the grow lights for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you're still going to get a good quality tomato in the long run. To conclude with this presentation, I think that it all boils down to your grower preference and the size of your greenhouse and the quickness and the speed of the operation that you're running. If you're someone like my boss, Mark Ivy at Ivy Gardens, you want to get those plants in and out as quick as possible. That frees up room, that lowers cost, and that keeps customers happy because you're always going to have a supply of plants. Now, if you're someone like me who has a small operation, like I said earlier, you have a little bit of wiggle room. You can go for the long run. You can get these sturdy, pretty plants, and that is something that I actually prefer to do because I don't like to use growth retardants like some companies, for example, Bonnie, use on their plants. I don't think that's safe for the customer and the fruit coming off the plant. Sometimes the plants don't even come out of the growth retardant if it's not applied properly. And then, of course, grow lights aren't always needed. For example, back to my boss over there at Ivy Gardens, we don't even use grow lights. We take the trays and we plant them in, place them in the greenhouse. We let the sun do all the work for us. That lowers our cost and the plants turn out the same. Any questions, Dr. Ritchie?